Hey guys, I just have a little bit of information. This isn't going to be a long video. I hope not. And I just have some information as I was doing some greater studies on the book of Corinthians and the history of the church, and comparing it to the first book of Corinthians, the first letter that Paul wrote, and seeing the history and seeing the text of the word of the letters. And there's some understanding that's kind of like lost in translation, I guess, as I read, and it didn't really make a lot of sense to me. So I did some extra research, and I came up with some new information that I believe will not only help our study, but it'll help you in your study, not just for Second Corinthians, but also for First Corinthians, and it'll help you understand the context. So, as I stated in the first video, Second Corinthians is supposedly comprised of, or I don't think that's the right word, but they're put together with more than one letter. It's not just one straight letter. They believe that it's actually three different letters put into one, and because of the how they kept the letters and things like that, they believed, that they actually put two or three letters together when bringing together this second letter, what we call Second Corinthians. So I just want to give some information. I'm believing with this information, as I went over it, it actually gave me some understanding, like, wow, that makes sense now. And you can actually read through it with a clear understanding and a clear perspective, and it not be so confusing. And you got all this different information about this, that, and the other, and it helps to understand these things. So I want to kind of give you a timeline of some things, um, as to why the letter was written, and um, addressing certain things in there that if you read straight through it, it might come off, it might be you might have a lack of understanding because of how it was put together and why it was put together. So just take what I'm saying. I'm not saying this is found. What I'm about to say is not, this is, the Bible doesn't say this is what it says. No, but from history and context clues, excuse me, and seeing the context of the both of the letters, that this information is highly probable that I'm going to be giving to you. So, I'll just read the timeline that I have. All right. So this is the probable order of events from First Corinthians, before First Corinthians, First Corinthians, between First Corinthians and Second Corinthians. So the previous letter, now there's in First Corinthians 5:9, he talks about a previous letter that he wrote to them about some things. So Paul, he establishes the church in Corinth, and we see that in Acts 18, where he goes, and that's the account of his first going to Corinth. And that's when he first went and established that church. So after he established that church, he received some from his elders and deacons and leaders in that church. He received information about the church and about things that were going on. So in First Corinthians 5, chapter 5, verse 9, he talks about a previous letter that he wrote them. So this letter is supposedly lost and not around anymore. But through my research, I discovered that in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 14 through chapter 7, verse 1, if you take that passage out, you see that it has nothing to do with the context of the letter in 2 Corinthians. It doesn't make any sense. It seems out of place. And if you read it, you see how it closely relates to his what we call First Corinthians, and how it addresses things that he addresses in the letter of what we call First Corinthians. So they're believing, the scholars and the people who have researched these things, they're believing that Second Corinthians chapter 6 verses 14 through chapter 7 verse 1, it's like maybe 6 or 7 verses. They're believing that that is that previous letter that Paul wrote. So this would be considered the first letter that Paul wrote. So if you read Second Corinthians from chapter 6 verse 13. So if you're reading Second Corinthians and you come to Second Corinthians 6 verse 13, if you go straight to Second Corinthians 7 verse 2, as if there's no chapter 6 verse 14 through 7 and 1, if you just read from 6 and 13 to 7 and 2, the flow of the letter goes much smoother than if you were to place 6:14 through 7:1 in there. So they're believing, these scholars and these people who've done this research, they're believing that the previous letter that is talked about in 1 Corinthians 5:9 is actually the first letter that Paul ever wrote to the Corinthians. And it's only comprised of I think it has 18 verses in chapter 6 of 2 Corinthians. So 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and then verse 1 of chapter 7. So it's like 6 verses, which is they believe is the first letter that was sent to the Corinthians. And then Paul's he establishes the church, okay, in Corinth. Then he hears about the things that are going on in the church, so he sends them a letter, which is 2 Corinthians 6:14 through 7:1. He sends them that letter, okay? Then after he sends that letter, Paul receives Chloe's people, the household of Chloe, which is stated in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Archaicus. And they receive, and Paul receives the letter from the Corinthian church from these people. So stated at the end of First Corinthians, he talks about these people that he's in fellowship with, that he has relation with, that he talks to. And then also in the beginning of First Corinthians, he talks about how Chloe's household, that he's heard from them about the divisions. So Paul also references how about what they have wrote to him, and I think that is found in. If you just give me 1 second, let me. I just want to give you scripture so you can look at this with me. Just give me 2 seconds, please. So it's 1 Corinthians 7:1 and 1 Corinthians 16, 17, and 1:11. Okay, so what we were saying, let's just go back through it just real quick. So Paul establishes the church in Acts 18. Okay. Paul establishes the church as in stated in Acts 18 verses 1 through 17. Then he hears about things that's going on in the church in that area, and he sends them a letter, which is what we call 2 Corinthians 6 verse 14 through 7:1. He sends them that letter. Then after he sends that letter, the people write back to him concerning some things, and he receives that letter from Chloe's people, Stephanus, Fortunatus, and Archaicus. He receives that letter in the news from the church, which is stated in 1 Corinthians 7:1. He says, now concerning the things which you wrote about, which you wrote to me, is 1 Corinthians 7:1. And in 1 Corinthians 16:17, well, let me just read it real quick. I'm glad about the coming of Stephanus, Fortunatus, and Archaicus, for what was lacking on your part they supplied. So they came and brought news along with the household of Chloe, as stated in 1 Corinthians 1:11. For it has been declared to me concerning my brethren by the household of Chloe that there is contentions among you. That's 1 Corinthians 1:11. Okay. So since I established that, I'm just going to run through it just real quick again. Paul establishes the church in Acts 18 verses 1 through 17. Then he hears of their situation and what's going on, so he sends them the letter, aka 2 Corinthians 6:14 through 7:1. Then the Corinthian church write him a letter in response to his letter, asking about some things. So he receives that letter along with the state of the church from the household of Chloe, Stephanus, Fortunatus, and Archaicus. He receives that letter and those people and the report of them and how the church is going. Then that's when Paul writes 1 Corinthians. And Paul is writing in response to their letter and the report that he received from the church, the letter from the church to him, and then from the report of those people to him. That's when he writes 1 Corinthians in response to that letter and their report. And that letter was sent to the church of Corinth by Timothy, and you see that in 1 Corinthians 4:17. So then the situation grows worse, and Paul pays a personal visit to the church of Corinth, which ends in failure and anguish at Paul's heart. So after he writes that letter, things continue to get worse. They don't get any better. And he hears that also through his leaders and his deacons and his elders. So Paul plans a trip and he goes to Corinth, and he has a personal visit to them. And because of them not receiving him well and not receiving the things that he's saying, it ends up in failure. They're mad at him. And you got to remember also, as I stated in the other video, there are these different teachers coming out here and kind of condemning him and kind of saying things like he's not a true apostle, okay? And they're saying all these bad things against Paul. So Paul leaves. So in consequences of that visit, because it didn't end well and it didn't go well, the consequences of that visit in the lost letter is contained in 2 Corinthians chapter 10 verses chapter 13. And that was dispatched by Titus, 2 Corinthians 2:13 and 7:13. You see that it was dispatched. So in response to his visit that didn't go well, he writes this severe letter, which he addresses in 2 Corinthians. So he addresses the letter in 2 Corinthians 2 2, let me just get the scriptures. I'm sorry that I don't have this. I thought I had it prepared a little better than what I did. So just give me a second, please. Just bear with me. Okay, in chapters 2 Corinthians chapter 7 verse 8, for though I caused you sorrow by my letter, I do not regret it. Though I did regret it, for I see that the letter caused you sorrow, though only for a little while. And then in chapter 2, verse 4, 2 Corinthians, for out of much affliction and anguish of heart I wrote to you in many tears, not so you would be made sorrowful, but that you might know the love which I have especially for you. Okay. And Paul, unable to wait for the answer. So now Paul, after he sent this severe letter, he's waiting to hear back from the church. He's waiting to hear back. He sent Titus to deliver this letter, this severe letter, 10 through 13 of 2 Corinthians, chapter 10 through chapter 13 of 2 Corinthians. So now Paul is waiting in Troas. He's waiting in Troas for the return of Titus to give him the report of the church because of his severe letter. He's waiting to see what Titus is going to say about the state of the church because he has a genuineness and care for this church. And it says since Paul was unable to wait for an answer in Troas, he sets out to meet Titus to hear of their state because he's so concerned. And that's stated 2 Corinthians 2, 12 and 13 and 2 Corinthians 7, 5 through 7. So he meets Titus in Macedonia and learns that all is well. And probably from Philippi is where he writes 2 Corinthians chapters 1 verses through chapter 9. And that's the reconciliation letter. Okay, so now with all that being said, let me just go straight through it one more time with all that information and give it to you exactly how the letter is supposed to be played out. And it'll give you an order on how to read 1st and 2nd Corinthians in an order where you can understand the meaning of the text. So this is the probable order of how you should read 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Okay, so first you should read 1 Corinthians 5, the first letter you should read before even reading 1 Corinthians, you should read 2 Corinthians 6, 14 through 7, 1. That is Paul's first letter to the Corinthian church, okay? You should read that letter first. Then you should know that Paul, or that Chloe's household, Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Archaicus, they, in response to that first letter, they bring a letter and a report of the Corinthian church from the Corinthian church. So they bring a report of the Corinthian church and they bring a letter from the church to Paul, okay? Then that's when 1 Corinthians was written. So first you should read 2 Corinthians 6, 14 through 7, 1, and know that Paul had people come to him and tell them about their state and bring them a letter. And then you should read 1 Corinthians. That's Paul's response to the state of the church brought to him by the household of Chloe, Stephanas, Fortunatus, and Archaicus, and through that letter that they sent. Okay? And then that letter was delivered by Timothy. Okay, and then the situation grows worse. After 1 Corinthians, things don't get any better, okay? Things get worse. So that's when Paul pays a personal visit and things don't go well at all, okay? He's grieved by the way they received him and by the things that are going on and the doctrines that they're listening to through these other super teachers or super Christians. So he leaves, okay? So as he leaves, Paul writes 2 Corinthians 10, chapter 10 through 13 in response to his visitation there. So first you should read 2 Corinthians 6, 14 through 7, 1 first. Then you should read First Corinthians. Then after you read First Corinthians, don't jump right into Second Corinthians. Read chapters 10 through 13 in Second Corinthians first. Then after you read that, understand and read chapters 1 through 9. So I hope I came off clear. Basically, there was a mix-up, and you have to understand that there was a lot going on. There was these letters going back and forth, and people, they just received it the best way they could. Paul didn't write First Corinthians, Second Corinthians, send it off. No, there were multiple letters that went out. They got mixed up, and that's where our Second Corinthians is comprised of. So this is the order that I believe you should read in to give you a greater understanding, and it'll help us as we do our study. So what I might even do is I might even read 10 through 13 in our next video, and break that down first, and then I might come back and begin our study back on Second Corinthians, the first part of it. But I believe this is very important for us as we're studying the Corinthian letter. We can, I'm not necessarily trying to do it in a progressive order where we need to go back and read First Corinthians first, because there's things in Second Corinthians I want to cover. So that's why I'm doing this. But I think it'll be more beneficial for us if we're really studying the context and the meaning of the passage. It'll help if we look at the progressive order of how it was written. So I just wanted to state that if you see the study of 10 through 13, this is why. Is through this information I've realized that that's how the letter is written and how it was brought together. And you can take it as you want, but I believe if you read it in the order that I've just stated and you actually read it in context, you'll see that you'll get a greater understanding and that it makes more sense, okay? So thank you guys for watching. I just wanted to give you this information. If you got any questions, just post and comment. Love you guys. Y'all have a great night.